Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our seminar today, The Toxic Legacies of the Oil and Gas Industry, Lessons in Decommissioning from the Niger Delta to North America with Anna Zelic and Isaac Usuoka. I'm Mary Viktorovich, the Interim Director of the Dadala Institute, and before we get started, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. And as this is a hybrid event, and some of us are in different territories, please take time and space to give thanks and gratitude and respect to the land you're currently living and working on. Today, we're here on the York University campus, situated on the traditional territorial area known as Toronto, and we acknowledge its current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We also acknowledge this as traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Watten Bell Covenant, an agreement to peaceably care and share for the Great Lakes region. And we also consider this as just the first step in our process of reconciliation and getting to know and work with our Indigenous nations. So in terms of our speaker profile, Professor Anna Zelic is a Dadala Institute Fellow and Professor in the Global Geography, Environmental and Urban Change at York University, where she teaches international environmental politics and the political ecology of extraction, with a focus on the merging of corporate security and social interventions in strategic exporters countries, particularly Nigeria, Mexico, and Canada. And we're also very privileged that Isaac Usuoka can join us, who holds a doctorate from York University and is a former Vanier Scholar. He coordinates Social Action International, an organization promoting resource democracy and human rights and livelihoods of marginalized communities in West and Central Africa. He's participated in many international fora and served as a panelist at the UN Experts Group meeting on the use of non-renewable resource revenues for sustainable local development. So thank you so much, Anna, for being here, and over to you and to Isaac.
Thank you so much, Mary, and also to the Dadala Institute for supporting a symposium that we held in April with relation to the report. Thank you, Isaac. To advance here.
You should be able to hit enter.
Okay. Actually, Isaac, do you want to just cover this slide, or should I move forward to the Bayelsa material? Okay, I'll just, one of the things, this broader project that we're doing on the divestment of the oil transnationals from the Niger Delta is part of a global trend where firms are leaving locations that are seen as very risky from a financial perspective because of the toxic liabilities associated with decades of pollution. And so Isaac, for instance, has been following the Curacao example, which has various things in common with the current dynamic in the Niger Delta, where Shell and other transnationals are selling off their assets to Nigerian indigenous firms, as they're called. And this process was accelerated to some extent after the publication, the launch of our report, the Bayelsa State Oil and Environmental Commission report. So, here we have just the images of those of us who were involved. The report was chaired by the former Archbishop of York, John Sentamu, and those of us who were on something called the Expert Working Group led the research. This was coordinated primarily by our colleague, as you see in the top right-hand corner, Dr. Catherine Wajiaku-Dahu, who directs the Politics and Governance program at ODI UK. Dr. Roland Hodler, whose research I'll mention in a minute, is there. We have down here Professor Michael Watts, who is a very well-known geographer internationally with decades of research in Nigeria and a specialist on the Niger Delta. John Kufuor, the former Prime Minister of Ghana, and Gbobor Mese, who is now the head of the law school at Aberystwyth in the United Kingdom, Isaac here, and Baroness Valerie Amos, who is now the director, has been director of sort of chair of various universities in the UK, including at one point directing SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, and that's the Archbishop in the corner. So the work that we conducted was started in 2019, and it was supported initially by the Bayelsa State government that wanted to conduct a report that would have elements in common with a report that was conducted by the United Nations Environment Program on the Ogoni region in Rivers State in Nigeria. On the state of Bayelsa, which is the central state of the Niger Delta and the most impacted by decades of oil pollution. And the commission's role was to address 6 decades of oil pollution and examine the impact of that pollution, including key features of the Nigerian oil industry and the ways in which they enable ongoing pollution. We looked as well at the dynamics of what are referred to as the joint ventures, so the partnerships between the transnational oil firms, the international oil companies, and the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, in which, as Isaac alluded to, there's been sort of a long-standing relationship as well with militarized regimes in Nigeria that were responsible, for instance, for the, as it is called, judicial murder of Ken Saro-Wiwa, that some here will be familiar with in 1995, the 30th anniversary of his execution by the Nigerian state has just recently passed. We also examined the regulatory challenges, the competing jurisdiction between various branches of the government, and the environmental impact of the industry. And what we saw basically was what has been demonstrated, frankly, in many reports conducted by civil society in Nigeria over decades, which is a devastated ecology in this region. And, you know, this report, in a sense, followed on an uptick in the amount of peer-reviewed research conducted on the long-term impact of the oil and gas industry. So, I'm not sure what the level of specialization is on that topic in this room, but in general, the oil and gas industry's health impact is severely under-researched at the global level. And if you talk to people in oil-producing countries and oil-producing regions, including environmental scientists, and I've had these conversations over, a 25 to 30 year period with scientists in a number of different countries, there's historically been very limited research to look at the environmental health implications, the direct environmental health implications of the oil industry. But this is starting to change slowly. And so there's been an increase in research, and I'll mention some of the research that informed the study. The commission's work was extensive. We collected over 500 stakeholder testimonies. We collected 1,600 blood samples. So in conjunction with the General Hospital in Yenagoa, which is the capital city of Bayelsa State, we conducted research that would allow us to look at the presence of different heavy metals in the bloodstream. And the result was basically the long-term impact and the very easily measurable impact of the oil and gas industry on population health. As indicated, in producing the report, we brought out a few statistics that would be kind of evocative for people, one of them being that there has been an oil spill every 12 hours for 14 years in Bayelsa State. Bayelsa has also experienced the Exxon Valdez spill 10 to 15 times over in a 15-year period. So in a state that has about 2.3 million people, we're looking at a massive devastation of the ecology of the region. And we looked at water, soil, and food contamination and direct human exposure. So we found chromium at 1,000 times the World Health Organization's safe limit in groundwater. Total petroleum hydrocarbons were measured at 1 million times the acceptable level in some communities. Drinking water sources were routinely polluted with hydrocarbons and heavy metals. We found bioaccumulation in the food chain and also uncovered chronic liver and kidney toxicity that is the result of bioaccumulation. As Isaac mentioned, hormonal disruption and reproductive dysfunction has also been measured and was previously demonstrated in a study that our colleague Roland Hodler co-authored. That I'll mention on the next slide. And, one thing that we talked about that, again, has been demonstrated in many reports over decades is that the mangroves in the area have seen a 40% loss over the period of oil and gas production in the Niger Delta. Now, all of us involved with the expert working group are people who have conducted, a couple of Isaac and Professor Messe are originally from the Bayelsa River State region of Nigeria. And Catherine and Michael and I have been studying this region and studying the global oil and gas industry's impacts for 25 to 35 years in Michael's case. So in having this sort of systematic study conducted, we were very cognizant of all of the previous research that had been done, and that this was adding additional weight to existing research that would allow us to demonstrate the long-term damages and call on the international community to insist on a fund that would lead to repair of the region. And that, among our recommendations is that there is a need for $12 billion to clean up Bayelsa State alone in funding from the international oil community. Bayelsa holds hosts 17 active gas flaring sites. So gas flares exist in many places, and Nigeria is not the highest gas flare in the world. But one of the things that is unusual in the Bayelsa State is how many people live within walking distance of a gas flare, and how many of these flares remain surface flares. So huge flares on the ground, as opposed to ones that are emitted through towers. This leads to soot and acid rain, and the accumulation of long-term carcinogens. It leads to health impacts, including chronic bronchitis, skin and eye irritation, birth defects, and it corrodes water systems and infrastructure, including roofs of houses. So there are a lot of damages associated with the oil industry's impacts. And now the blood samples in particular, I want to highlight one particular study that contributed to the importance, I think, of this research. And that is a study that was conducted by Roland Hodler and a colleague of his, that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences the year that the commission began its work, that demonstrated a causal relationship, so not a correlation, but a causal relationship between oil spills and neonatal mortality in Bayelsa State. And this was based on the most publicly, the best available data on that could examine the relationship between spills and those health indicators in the Niger Delta. Nearly 50% of children in spill-impacted communities are underweight. There is immune suppression leading to chronic infections, complications from malaria, reduced healing of wounds, and there's elevated rates of cancers in the adult population. The life expectancy in the region has collapsed to 50 years. It's slightly higher in Nigeria as a whole. So Nigeria as a whole doesn't have particularly high life expectancy for a series of other reasons that we can talk about later if we want. But life expectancy is lower in Bayelsa State and in the Niger Delta in general. And I will pass on with that to Isaac.
And I mentioned that the estimation for the remediation of the Bayelsa environment, will be 12 billion, and that 12 billion is over 12 years. That is the assumption that 1 billion is expended every year over a 12-year, the initial 12-year period, with the understanding that considering the enormity of the devastation and lasting health impact, that remediation processes will continue beyond 12 years. And we also take note of the United Nations Environment Program report of the assessment of pollution in Ogoniland, which was published in 2011. In that case, the UNEP suggested that it will cost $1 billion over the first 5 years just to set up the infrastructure for the cleanup of Ogoniland. And Ogoniland is in River State. It's different from Bayelsa. And Ogoniland is just a small area of River State. And so based on the enormity of the pollution and the health impact, for example, the UNEP discovered benzene in a community called Isikikat Ogale in Elemen Ogoniland. That in that community, that the wells that people dug wells that people used to access water for drinking contains benzene at levels of 900 times above the safety limit set by the World Health Organization. That's how stark the data that came out of the UNEP report for Ogoniland was. We found similar thing, of course, as Anna, similar data as Anna highlighted from Bayelsa State. Now, we also note that in the past few years that communities from Nigeria, a few communities from Nigeria, from Ogoniland and elsewhere, have accessed courts in the United Kingdom and in the Netherlands to try to seek redress. And some of them have been one or two have been successful in compelling Shell in particular to make some out of court settlement, for example, and pay some substantial amount to the communities. Now, when these companies realized that it will be increasingly difficult to evade responsibility, considering the UNEP report and also the Bayelsa report, they expedited efforts to dump these assets, these investments onto so-called indigenous companies. And talking about indigenous companies, if we mention particularly the last sale by Shell, where they transferred all their remaining onshore investments to a so-called Nigerian company called Renaissance, we find that number one, that it was Shell that established this company. It was Shell's, the executives of this new company, Renaissance, past executives of Shell who literally quit their job in Shell to set up this company. The fund for buying the shares from Shell was provided to this company by Shell itself. So Shell funded a company to buy its onshore assets in Nigeria. And the reason is very simple: to evade responsibility for historical liabilities, as has been mentioned by Anna. And we also have to look at the implication, the implication of this. What does it mean really when these companies do this? What they tell us, what they say is that they have transferred assets and liabilities to these new entities that have taken over their onshore assets. But if we look at an example from Nigeria, where Shell sold one of the early sales or transfer of assets involving a so-called indigenous company called ITO, the result has been that the environmental practice of these new entities have been even worse than what Shell recorded in some respects. There was a major oil blowout in Santa Barbara, I think that's 2021. An oil well that has been abandoned for many years, even prior to the sale by Shell, exploded and spewed oil into the environment for over a month without any response from the company or the Nigerian regulators. So we see a situation where indigenous capital, the elites, are becoming major players in this sector, and there are some who will argue that local content development, that is called in Nigeria in this context, is good. It promotes indigenous capital, but the reality is that we now have a group of people who have power, who have been empowered, through investments in fossil capital, who have access to the state. For example, one of the indigenous companies that has taken over some of these investments is owned by the family of the current president of Nigeria, Tinubu. Tinubu's family owns one of the companies. They have stakes in these ventures. So we see a situation where the state is increasingly serving as a protector of these deals, shielding international oil companies of their responsibility to clean up and pay for the damage that they have done in exchange for the toxic stakes that they have acquired. Now, if we look at the next slide, coming back to this particular deal. I already talked about this ITO. So let's look at the next slide. Yes, and that's Curacao. This is what is happening in Nigeria is not unique. It's not unique in terms of the failure to decommission oil infrastructure. This is something that is, when state regulators and when the politics of particular states allow it, depending on how entrenched petrocapital is within different states, this becomes a norm. Oil infrastructure, they just basically walk away from this infrastructure that continue to pollute. And that is the reality in Nigeria, as well as Canada, for example, in Alberta, as Anna will show very soon. But we look at Curacao, for example, in the 1980s, in 1985, specifically, after decades of operating, a very profitable refinery in Curacao, Shell abandoned, a dilapidated, refinery in the country, and they sold this major infrastructure to the government of Curacao in 1985 for $1 or one Dutch gulden. It was just a token amount to hand over this asset to the government of Curacao, almost free of charge to take over this investment. But the sale contract included a clause that Shell will not be held liable for any past or future environmental pollution. That's in Curacao in 1985. Shell knew, they were very, very aware, conscious of the fact that decades of refining had left behind a major environmental disaster in that area, with severe soil and water contamination from hydrocarbons and heavy metals. The refinery site and surrounding areas remain heavily polluted up to today, posing ongoing environmental and health challenges for the small island. Up to today, the government and the people of Curacao continue to struggle with the remediation and restoration efforts needed to address this toxic legacy. So this is not new. What is happening in Nigeria is not new. It's use and dump and evade responsibility and walk away. But what we see that is new is that this asset dumping, toxic asset dumping, is now used as part of the greenwashing by these companies, because they can now use the word divestment, which seems to resonate, with some Western environmental campaigners in places like Norway, for example, who say, "Oh yeah, we have the victory. Shell has moved out from the Niger Delta of Nigeria. They have divested," but that is not what is happening. That is not divestment, because they are moving offshore and they are seeking to promote to produce more crude oil in that space. Next slide, please. So it's I'm looking at the time as well. It's in discussing divestments, in discussing the energy transition, by whatever phrase used, whatever term used, whether it is just transition or the other, it is important to consider all contexts, and very often discussions around the climate change and climate discourses have been shaped by northern activists and scholars and politicians, and it is not always the case that the framing of discourses reflect the realities in every part of the world. For example, in the 1990s, at the time when the global environmental justice discourse was emerging as in the form of the Shell boycott of the 1990s, for example, there was a focus on um, on emissions reduction. There was a focus on mitigating emissions through a reduction of production. But within the Ogoni movement, for example, in Nigeria, the movement for the survival of Ogoni people led by Keseruwa, whose campaigns greatly influenced, this international movement, there was a discussion about resource control. There was a discussion about, for example, self-determination. There was a discussion about cultural sovereignty, because oil didn't just pollute the land, but that the political economy of oil within that context created a dispossessing of communities in ways that goes beyond just the health impact and the economic impact. And it's important to take all of these considerations, even as we move forward with pushing for a just energy transition. The point to make is that energy transition has to be comprehensive in its packaging, that beyond the reduction of CO2, that we have to also take into consideration the historical legacies of oil. If an oil company just packs away and leaves, the cancer, and the diseases, the impact of benzene and chromium in the bloodstream of people will last. And those are issues that have to be addressed, for example. And these companies have made billions of dollars. They make billions of dollars annually in profit. So it is imperative that a framework should be established for making the polluter pay. I will hand over back to Anna at this point.
Okay. Thank you, Isaac. So one of the things that we're thinking about with this work is what divestment should be, right? And as Isaac pointed out, what the oil industry is currently framing as divestment from Nigeria basically turns the global movement for divestment from the oil and gas industry on its head. So while students will understand a divestment movement as a movement to put pressure, for instance, on the financial holdings of their university or of their bank in the fossil fuel sector, and so to basically defund fossil fuels, what the oil industry has done in Nigeria is divest from assets that are toxic and risky for them because of the long-term liabilities and insurance implications of that investment. And similar dynamics are at play internationally, including in Canada and the United States. For those people who might be interested in the detailed political economy of this, a recent political science dissertation at York by Alexander Hermanutz discusses this in some detail and in a very interesting way with relation to the Alberta conventional oil and gas sector. But I'll just provide some snapshots of some of the kinds of research, and granted it's insufficient, that exists on the problem of basically oil and gas infrastructure abandonment, or as Alexander Hermanitz puts it, desertion internationally. So, there are a range of estimates on the liabilities posed by the need to plug and take care of fossil fuel infrastructure in the future. But these estimates are in the trillions. So there's estimates of that the long-term liabilities for oil and gas industry decommissioning in the United States are $1.2 trillion. The estimate in Alberta is likely over $260 billion. And the numbers of wells internationally, there are millions of wells that ultimately will need to be decommissioned. And the way in which they're decommissioned matters, because there's also fugitive emissions coming from already supposedly plugged and deserted wells. So there is a professor at McGill, Mary Kang, who has done quite a bit of research on these dynamics, both in the United States and Canada. And I just thought I'd highlight a couple of some of the findings of some of her recent research. So through an analysis of just under 500 nominally decommissioned wells in Canada, they found that the Environment and Climate Change Canada was likely underestimating fugitive methane emissions from those wells by 7 times. So in other words, the amount of emissions are 7 times higher than the Canadian government is reporting from the already decommissioned wells.
So they're leaking toxic.
Exactly. They're leaking emissions, and the amount that they're leaking emissions is 7 times higher than the national inventory on releases is reflecting. And this problem, is not only seen for methane emission leakages. There's been a lot of research about this on oil spill data across Canada, including by Sean Karaj, who was the former Associate Dean for Research of LAPS here at York University, that shows the gaps basically in the available data on oil spills across the country. My colleague Liette Gilbert and I have also looked at this across the country in terms of the way in which the federal government reports on spills, and the extent to which this is misleading. So, official documents will also state in Canada, and this is a problem across oil and gas exporters, that there are various different regulators producing data that is not complementary. So in other words, the figures produced at the provincial level about oil spills and at the federal level do not coincide. And I'm happy to share some examples of literature documenting this. And similar dynamics are seen clearly in the Nigerian context and elsewhere. One of the other recent publications by Pang and her colleagues note, for instance, that that what is referred to as the infrastructural fund. So there is a federal infrastructural fund in the United States that was formed under the Biden administration, involved with providing financing for various aspects of the energy transition. And the documented orphaned wells in their study, they looked at basically the extent to which the funding that was available through that infrastructure fund is sufficient to cover the costs of plugging those wells. And they found that it's, almost double the amount is required for just the documented orphaned wells. There's millions that are undocumented, and there's media coverage on this, including by NPR in the United States. That funding, which was inadequate, has now been canceled completely by the Trump administration. So the problem of toxic liabilities from the energy transition, the abandoned infrastructure, is something that is heavily sort of understudied and not attended to. So there's a lot of attention to the costs of transitioning to other energy sources. There's much more limited attention to the costs of cleaning up and decommissioning existing hydrocarbon infrastructure. So that is, to see, for quite a few years, I published on similarities between the Albertan regulatory context and the Niger Delta regulatory context, which for some Canadians is surprising to see the ways in which those contexts are actually quite similar in terms of under attention to pollution and under regulation of the industry. But this is a global problem, and it's documented also, for instance, by organizations like the International Energy Agency, which in its recent global methane tracker, the International Energy Agency is the organization of the major oil and gas countries in the global north and countries that host the international oil companies. So it's not considered any sort of a radical organization. It typically represents the interests of of states that have partnerships with industry. And their recent study also demonstrated an extreme underestimate in total methane emissions from official sources. And I'm happy to share that slide, a slide of their data as well, but it's available publicly if folks are interested. So we'll end it there and open for questions, I think.
Well, thank you so much, Anna and Isaac, for doing this extraordinary research as part of the commission. Because, of course, we need this made known, especially if government sources are themselves underestimating the harms.
Right.
Yeah. I think you mentioned in your report that within Nigeria, the regulatory sector is sort of very weak. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you could speak to that, because you would think that, if countries are allowed to operate, they should meet certain expectations.
Yeah. So, this is something we discussed quite a bit, because in the examples that were provided, initially some examples were provided to, how much better Canada is. And I warned against that because I said it's not necessarily all that much better. But one example, there was a whole series of under-maintained oil pipelines in the Niger Delta that should have been replaced and have not been after 6 decades of pollution. So corroding pipelines that the industry frequently blames spills from those pipelines on sabotage. And there is tampering with the pipelines in the Niger Delta, that is true. But there have been studies done, some commissioned by different environmental NGOs, that show that many of the spills that the international oil companies attributed to sabotage were in fact the result of corrosion, and that they misrepresented those spills. Those who have studied the oil and gas regulatory context in the Niger Delta for various decades will point at something called a joint investigation visit, which is carried out after a spill by a representative of the oil company, a representative in principle of the state regulatory agency, like federal, and the sub-state, so Bayelsa. So Nigerian federal government would typically have a representative at what these so-called joint investigation visits, where they go to the communities where the spills occurred. And sort of to give you a picture of that, in Bayelsa State, many of these communities are only accessible by boat. So it's a riverine area, and many of the communities are not accessible by land. So it's quite expensive to travel by boat, and it can also take a long time to arrange this travel. So sometimes, with relation to the Santa Barbara spill that Isaac provided the example of, it can take days or weeks until they even go to inspect. And then, because the funding for the joint investigation visit comes from the oil company, there is also various incentives at play to report on that spill in a way that's to the advantage of those companies. So either to blame the spill on some sort of local tampering, to underestimate the amount of the spill. So those are some examples. I don't know, Isaac, do you want to talk a little bit about Nostra and other things? Yeah.
Just to say that talking about weak regulation, and this is my view, not the necessarily the view of the Bayelsa Commission, is that there is a mutual interest in theft, between state officials and the oil companies. Talking about oil theft, one of the points to note is that in Nigeria there is no, for all these decades of extraction and export of oil through pipelines, there is no metering system to verify the quantity of crude oil and natural gas that has been exported via the export terminals. So you have oil wells and you have flow lines and pipelines that link up to the export terminals, and the state doesn't have the capacity, to determine the actual volume of oil that is going out. And this is of interest to the oil companies because whatever Nigeria is a member of the OPEC, and OPEC has a quota, export quota for all its member countries. But the Nigerian state, the Nigerian state doesn't have a capacity to verify how much, the quantity of oil that is going because the oil companies have been over exporting over the decades. And when you have this so-called system of this tampering or sabotage of oil pipeline infrastructure, the failure to to monitor and to protect the pipelines is also a conscious response of industry and the state because it gives the companies an excuse to so it's okay. There's low export figures is because somebody has tampered with the pipelines. That opaque regime in terms of the numbers of it's helped by this so-called sabotage oil theft system that we have. So that is a point to consider. Another thing is that we cannot divorce oil from the state. The way that the state has. Whether we talk about oil or we talk about what about mineral resources. The state has been created. These states have been created by, and it's not very long ago that these states were created historically. These are, whether it's Nigeria or Ghana or Tanzania, these are very recent, creations by industry. It is corporations. It was the British Royal Niger Company that created Nigeria as a facility to transfer wealth from the land to elsewhere. And when you have that and the entire infrastructure of the state, whether it is railway lines, that were built during colonialism or export terminals and everything, everything just points to the plunder of resources. And the states, even the character of the elite have been shaped by this order. So it's not just a simple discussion about regulation, but it's more about a restructuring and a reconstructing of the state and its character to one that will serve the interest of people. Is to recreate the colonial state into something new. And beyond this discussion about oil and regulation and health impact, we have to link it all up to fundamental state building questions.
That's really fascinating. Yes, I think, Michael, go ahead.
Someone mentioned that there has to be a framework for the polluter to pay. Obviously, there is the international principles, in international law principle, polluter pay principle, but I'm particularly interested in the legal relationship between the federal government and the states. And the question relates to the capacity of states to bring a legal case against an IOC to not the international court, but to the national court within Nigeria. So, do states have this? Are states able to do this?
Isaac, do you want to talk about?
Yes, the response is yes. States can sue the international oil companies within Nigerian courts. States, when there is a dispute with the federal government, can access the Supreme Court to intervene. The states as currently constituted going to do that? No. Is the Bayelsa State government set up the commission that produced this report? But is the Bayelsa State government since this report was published in 2023, has the Bayelsa State government done anything to push for implementation of this report? No. Because of the imperatives of politics within the country, the fact that ultimately in Nigeria elections don't votes don't count in determining elections. So in Bayelsa State, in the past month or thereabout, the governor of the state, who was a member of PDP, which was so-called opposition party, has moved to join the party that is in control of the federal government. Why? Because of fear that the federal government has the control of the Supreme Court, and if you don't support President Tinubu, you might be endangered one way or the other. And that is why the work that we are doing, following the end of the commission's work, we have some of us that were part of the expert working group and other allies have created an international working group to promote the implementation of this report, the recommendations of this report, because of the failure of the state government, in this case the Bayelsa State government, to act adequately. And we continue to encourage the Bayelsa State government to where it can, because now petroleum is under federal jurisdiction. So meaning that the state governments cannot regulate the oil industry, but land is under state jurisdiction. And so land use can be regulated by the state. And one of the recommendations that we have made to the Bayelsa State government in this case is to use its powers, with land use management to regulate the industry. For example, if there are pipelines that are old, corroded, and are easily giving way to spewing crude oil because of corrosion, the state government can order or withdraw land use license from the companies that operate those pipelines. But the state government has not responded. And that is why we are, and the organizations and the civil society organizations and the communities that are working on this issue are, using all different frameworks and, looking at whatever possibilities exist, even the courts. There are communities in Bayelsa State that have gone to court to challenge the so-called divestment, to call for compensation using the Bayelsa Commission report as evidence that is ongoing. So there are efforts at different levels to put pressure. And one of the pressure points will continue to be the government of Bayelsa State and the other states in the Niger Delta. Yes.
Okay, Habibi, to go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. My name is Habibetu. I'm also from Nigeria. I have a question for you. So, how are hospitals and clinics, how are they able to handle the oil spill related illnesses in Bayelsa?
Anna?
Well, I think one of the problems in Bayelsa State is, frankly, a lack of sufficient health infrastructure in a lot of the riverine communities. So people are not necessarily even receiving treatment or being able to speak to a doctor in the immediate aftermath of a spill because they're so pervasive. The Yenagoa General Hospital is tracking cancer cases. And there are some people receive treatment for cancer, but I think the problem in Bayelsa is probably a bit of a magnified problem to what might occur in other parts of Nigeria, where when people become quite ill with some sort of, an illness that maybe in this case that would be ecologically the result of toxicity, their ability to even access healthcare, quality healthcare, will be constrained because of where they live and the income that they have. Isaac, do you want to add to that?
No, not much to add to that. Just to say that for many of these communities in Bayelsa State, healthcare, as we know it, is just not. They don't have access to the healthcare that they need, and part of the recommendation that the Commission made in this report is for the provision of healthcare, and even additional studies to show even better how there is the linkage between the toxic exposures that we've talked about and the actual health and diseases and sickness that people suffer. There's need for more study in that respect. But in terms of health infrastructure, there are major gaps, and the access is very limited.
One other, and I was just going to say, I have another colleague of ours, Dr. M.M. Okon. The organization she works with, which is called Kebet Kache Women Development Center, when we can put in the chat. They recently published a report on women's health in Bayelsa State that would provide more information and recommendations that I think we would strongly recommend also that people consult. I believe I think it's on their website now, right? I think so. Anyways, okay. Imran, and then.
Thank you so much, Anna and Isaac, for a really eye-opening presentation. I had two questions reflecting on what Isaac was describing about the coloniality of the state, and then this question about local health capacity. One of the findings of the commission was the price tag of the cleanup, $12 billion, right? And I assume that's just current costs. It's just what needs to happen now to rehabilitate the current harms in the environment to prevent these downstream effects. During that same period in which those harms accumulated to the environment, is there an accounting that the commission found of how much wealth was extracted in terms of oil sales? And where did those flows wind up? Do they wind up in Shell's headquarters in the Netherlands? Were they in Nigeria? Where did they go? How much value was generated during that period that it generated a $12 billion price tag? So that's the first question. The second question is, these indigenous, so-called indigenous companies, which sound to me as the way you describe it, are just shell companies to insulate the international oil company from liability, and they're funded by the international company. Their purpose is to absorb the liability. With what end goal? Will they just go bankrupt and collapse, and then there'll be nobody to pursue their environmental liability? Is that the sort of plan in works here? Or will they actually have to figure out how to rehabilitate while shielding the parent company from that liability?
Isaac, is it okay if I say something to the last part of his question and then pass on to you? Is that just about the liability? I was just going to say that with relation to the role of those companies, at least some of it has to do with the ability of the international community to influence what occurs in Nigeria. So the Santa Barbara spill that Isaac gave the example of that occurred on a recently divested Shell holding, over the last 10, 15 years, if there was a really big blowout like that at a Shell holding, it would get international press coverage. When it's a national company, there's no international attention, and they know that this affects their share price. So that's part of the dynamic of the fact that they can they disassociate themselves from those damages, the same way that, and oil companies in Canada, frankly, are now trying to do similar things through somewhat more legitimate indigenous partnerships. But I'll pass on. Wanted to say, there's also organizations like Oil Watch, of which Isaac was the African coordinator for many years, have provided some documentation on the amount of oil wealth extracted, I think, from the global south, but I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Okay, oil is the oil economy has been described as an enclave in the economy, in not producing multiplier benefits for people, and part of the response to that reality from the Nigerian elite has been to promote local participation in that industry. And so in Nigerian speak, it's called local content. And so there was local content, even in legislation from I think the 1990s, I think. So this legislation stipulated, where Nigerians must be involved. If it is work, labor, there's some segment of work that should be reserved for Nigerians, for example. So if there is welding, it means that companies had, for example, the responsibility to ensure that welding contracts, for example, certain percentage of it goes to Nigerians. And this resulted in the emergence of the multiplication of Nigerian-owned oil servicing companies who became subcontractors to the major oil companies. Some of them, even as Nigerian oil companies, were just basically accepting contracts and re-awarding those contracts to international companies because they didn't always immediately have the capacity to do all of the work that they were contracted to do. At another level, the bigger players, those who had political connections, who were connected to the petroleum ministry or the presidency at different points, sought to engage in bigger deals. And so there was the idea of marginal fields. These are small oil fields or underproducing oil fields, which are marginal to the interests of the major international oil companies. So beginning again from the 90s, there was this attempt to hand over some of these marginal fields to Nigerian companies. And so there were a few Nigerian oil companies that became producers who got stakes in this marginal field. What has happened in recent years, in the past decade or thereabout, is that beyond marginal fields and oil servicing contracting, the oil companies, the international oil companies themselves needed to dump their assets. So this is different from what happened in the past. In the past, there was an emerging competition between the Nigerian, an emerging Nigerian petro-capitalist class and the international oil company. There was a competition, and that competition has played out, for example, in so-called, there's a Danetete Malabu oil deal. If you Google it, you will see, some of those histories, for example. But in this case, what we have seen in the past decade that has, particularly, 2024 and 2025, and even continuing, with Total, for example, Total Energies, for example, is that it is the international oil companies that want to leave. They want to leave exactly because they need to dump this asset, because these are becoming too much of a burden. The liabilities will be too much, and they have created and encouraged these new entities to take over. And concerning the question, what do they want to do? What do they want to do? With these liabilities. Do they at some point go bankrupt? I believe that is the plan. That is the case, that when the liabilities, when these issues are brought to the courts, at some point, some companies will prefer to go bankrupt, and there are loans and banks, and for example, in the case of Shell and Renaissance, it is Shell money. Shell has given about is it $2 billion or thereabout dollars or less than that to Renaissance to buy its assets. Compared to what if we're going to compute Shell's liabilities in the entire Niger Delta, that's just a fraction of what it will be. And what if Renaissance goes bankrupt and they lose everything? Technically, legally, and technically, nobody will be held responsible for all the historical pollution and the harm that has been caused in the area. Now, concerning wealth, yes, the Bayelsa report Commission report gave an estimation as to how much wealth has been extracted from Bayelsa State over the years. I cannot give that figure right now, but just to say that the Nigeria generally, the Niger Delta generally has been for companies like Shell, its most profitable area. Nigeria's operation has been Shell's most profitable operation for many decades. There was a particular period when about 14% of all of Shell's profits globally came from Nigeria alone. More than that. So we're talking about lots of money. Lots of money. Where had this money ended up? Of course, it ended up in with the shareholders in Europe. Revenues have been paid to the Nigerian state, where the bulk of those revenues ended up, unfortunately, in so those funds have been stolen and ended up in different jurisdictions, even lost in different jurisdictions where people die and there's no trace of where they kept their money, unfortunately.
I think there was thanks.
So of course, it was like with a lot of information, and even I think the commission did a fantastic job in bringing up a big report. But of course, that was my question: what happened after the recommendations? With 10 recommendations, and already, as I answered, that nothing was done as of now. And of course, there is a great research evidence inequity, which I'm kind of feeling there. Though there is an inequity in research itself, but as of now, the WHO agencies like IR, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which has already identified so many toxic material, these are all the class 1 carcinogens, these are all the class 2 carcinogens. I don't think there is need to be kind of additional studies to prove that these chemicals are going to cause these diseases, because these are all already available, which can be taken up maybe in an amended report of the commission that can be used. And but I have two questions. One is there was one of the slide mentioned that there are $30 million secret settlement was done. What happened to this $30 million? Whether it was used for kind of remediating things, or it has actually went to just some people's pocket. So that is one question. The second thing is whether these compensations, like in the UK court or in Polish court or different countries, international courts, whether these compensations are actually, once again, I'm feeling that there may be a compensation inequity. Like, for example, in Alberta, there is things happening, and then it is kind of in Canadian court, it is getting sued, and the Canadian court may actually kind of sanction a high level of compensation. And if the same thing happening for Nigerians or Nigerian people actually applying or suing the company in Canadian court, they may be given a low level of compensation. So what is your thought on this?
Okay, I'll pass the you, Isaac, but just with relation to Alberta, I just mentioned that some of the recent work, and I'm thinking here of the Herman's dissertation as well, but there is other material published on this, as demonstrating a system where basically the liabilities will be socialized onto the taxpayer. Yeah. And this is the concern, right? That ultimately the general public is going to have to pay for these, whatever the liabilities as they accrue in the future. And rather than the polluter paying through different forms of bankruptcy proceedings, the ultimate cost of these will not be shouldered by those who made the profit from the industry. There's a lot of sort of features at play in the Alberta case, including around, there's a regulatory agency that is supposed to be responsible for this that is grossly underfunded. So I'm sure, it's probably worse elsewhere, but Alberta is definitely not, I say as an Albertan originally, it's not a shining example. Anyways, yeah. Isaac, on the secret deal example. Which was
that's, we served in a commission that was established by the Bayelsa State government. And it is, the Bayelsa State government in Nigeria has responsibility to work towards implementing some of these recommendations. And in our attempt to encourage the Bayelsa State government, we've often been hesitant about critiquing publicly critiquing the Bayelsa State government. No, but this issue of $30 million is one that is, to say the least, fishy. That in around from what would not understand, that around 2006 or 2016, not 2016, I think, the Bayelsa State government imposed a levy, land use levy on Shell for its Bahrain field, because the Bayelsa State government has jurisdiction over land use, and so it can impose levies. The Shell challenged the levy in court, and so there had been this contest in court in Nigeria for a bit. In 2023, the Bayelsa Commission made the report, this report, public, and that's by December, a few months after the Bayelsa Commission report was published. Shell approached the Bayelsa State government and offered to settle that particular case, land use levy case, out of court, and the result was that at least about $30 million was paid to the Bayelsa State government. This amount was paid to the Bayelsa State government in a manner that was very opaque. The people of Bayelsa State, don't know about this payment. The government of Bayelsa State did not announce this payment to the publicly. This payment became known because the state assembly, the state legislature, somebody with access to the state legislature leaked the information that the governor of Bayelsa State was seeking, appropriation of this amount away, from the regular budget of the state. And so because this, if this money comes to the government of the state government cannot spend the money without appropriation. But what would be interesting is that if a government that is representing the people, like Bayelsa State, for example, is in court against Shell in this case, and then they settle out of court, Shell pays $30 million. That is a win for the government and the people against this corporate giant. What you will expect the government to do is to advertise the win, and to show that it is possible to at least extract compensation or whatever from the company. But in this case, the government, hid this payment, and so we do not know. The people of Bayelsa do not know, what was agreed between the government of Bayelsa and Shell. Which agents were involved in the negotiation and what percentage of the funds ended up in the hands of negotiators or agents of government or Shell. What is known is that this amount, that the government of Bayelsa sought to appropriate this amount through the assembly. Was it a first installment of more money? It is not known. It's a shady payment that was made a few months after the Bayelsa Commission published its report. And this payment was made at the same time that Shell announced that it will now sell off all its assets in the Niger Delta. And so this seems to me, considering the silence of the Bayelsa State government, that this seems to me to be part of a bribe. And this is my view. This is not the view of the Bayelsa Commission. That this is a bribe that has been paid by Shell to the Bayelsa State government to keep quiet about all of these issues. Because the reality is that the Bayelsa State government has kept quiet about this. All this. The governor has made a few speeches, here and there, when it is convenient for him to do so. But acting as a governor, zero.
I just feel kind of not a win, because the commission actually estimated $12 billion and then they just settled with $30 million.
Yeah, a stark difference.
It's a bribe. It's a bribe. Yeah.
It's not a true payout. It's a quiet.
It's very hard sometimes to track the profits of an oil company because they own the entire value chain.
Yes.
So Shell owns its own gas stations. They're all incorporated in the country. So even a small country like the Bahamas, the Shell is owned by a foreigner, right? Because they control the whole value chain. But they also know how to siphon off profits. Just for the last quarter, Shell did $3.5 billion in stock buybacks, which is another word for financial fraud. And so they're siphoning off money. Oh, that's just for 3 months. It's amazing. Comment. My question is, somebody mentioned that the 40% of the mango trees,
40% of the mangrove.
The swamp, but that's underpins the entire ecosystem, right?
Absolutely.
So that means basically, if you're losing 40% of your ecosystem, everything just washes into the ocean. Is that fair?
Yes.
I mean, erosion is a big problem in the area.
Absolutely.
And it's been, the documentation is limited. On the point about, with relation to Imran's point and the comment you just made about Shell and value chain, there's a Dutch organization, SOMO, which is the Center for Research on Multinationals, and they provide they've done a lot of work on Shell, various reports also on the role of the commodity traders, because they're very opaque bodies that also are involved with sort of import-export of oil and gas production into, say, Rotterdam, which is the main location where the oil spot market operates. But SOMO is one possible source for the kinds of things that were just referenced.
Well, maybe one last one.
I just want to come back quickly to this the legal framework here. I like the comment you made about Alberta, of course, in relation to Nigeria. There's no observation that whether it's flaring in Nigeria or the oil sands or the oil sands in Alberta and the communities downstream from Port McMurray having bad water to drink, is the challenges are more or less the same globally, but going to the historic comment that was made about oil, about Shell and Nigeria, the state per se. Of course, the Nigerian government has a constitution, and the 1993 constitution, the section 2 of it, chapter 2 of it, provides for the states to address virtually all the socio-ecological challenges that your report mentioned, whether it's health or human rights or whatnot. And I'm curious, going with the empirical evidence in your report, why is it, or does it appear that the Nigerian government itself over the years has not been implementing its own laws?
Well, it might be the same reasons that the Canadian government is not implementing its own laws, but maybe in that there is a partnership between the state and the hydrocarbon industries. It's a major source of income to state coffers. But we'll pass it on. I mean, one of the things, we launched this report in Nigeria almost exactly a year ago. So the report had been released in May 2023. And then at the end of October, November 2024, we did a launch in Yenagoa, in the capital Bayelsa State, and in Abuja, at which we put a lot of effort into ensuring that there would be important kind of governmental representatives to try and, elicit a commitment. And as Isaac pointed out, there was definitely commitments, stated commitments in that context, but the actual implementation of legislation that would force this or the use of existing laws to enforce this is something else. But yeah. Isaac, do you want to comment on that?
In 2024, throughout 2024, there were a lot of protests by Nigerian communities in the Niger Delta, beyond Bayelsa State, in River State, in Bayelsa State, in Delta State, against the asset sell-offs. The target was the state regulator, in this case, the Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission, NUPRIC, for short, which has the power to accept or reject demands for asset transfers. Communities and NGOs also targeted the National Assembly to push for a halt to all such divestments. And the National Assembly, particularly the House of Representatives in Nigeria, at some point, 2 times in 2024 and even earlier in 2025, passed a resolution, not law, but resolution calling for a halt to all divestments, all international oil company divestments. They commenced a process of public hearings to investigate the matter, and they were pretty serious about it. The regulator rejected Shell's request to sell the assets to Renaissance. That it was rejected. As at between September and October 2024, NUPRIC rejected Shell's request. In December 2024, there was a delegation of some interest. The government of the United Kingdom and the government of the Netherlands sent a delegation to President Tinubu of Nigeria and with Shell and threatened to withdraw or to suspend about 12 billion in offshore investments in the oil and gas industry, and that if the sale to Renaissance is not approved, that they will no longer go ahead with those investments. And so Tinubu immediately ordered the regulator because Tinubu is, in fact, the Minister of Petroleum in Nigeria, who has the power to accept or reject the regulator's recommendation. But President Tinubu ordered the regulator to change its recommendation, and to approve the sale, because of a 12 billion or so investment that is the challenge. The challenge is that the government is presented with it's like a blackmail all the time from the oil industry. That if you attempt to regulate us, we are going to pull off our investments, we're going to withdraw our investments, and that will impact on the revenue of the government and all of that. And always the government caves into those kind of pressure. It's cheap blackmail, but it's blackmail that works, with the government in Nigeria, unfortunately.
That is very unfortunate, because in the end, those companies aren't the only ones who could create those investments, right? I mean, if there's oil there, I'm sure there would be other interested parties, and maybe it could be done in a more, equitable way. But anyways, what is done is done. So, well, thank you so much for enlightening all of us, Isaac and Anna. And, yeah, we support you and in solidarity with your continued research. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.